January 30th, Entry A, explaining electrogravitics, sometimes referred to as anti-gravity, very frequently misunderstood. Forgive my primitive chalkboard here, but it's the best way I have of demonstrating this. Okay, so if you'll imagine a circuit, right? And at one end of the circuit, we have a surplus of electrons. At the other end, a shortage of electrons. And in between it, we have a gyroscopic cabin. There's my pilot. Doesn't even really need, this is assuming you need a pilot, which hypothetically this vehicle would. You would not be able to operate it remotely due to the, well, at least not via radio frequencies, due to its inherent model. Anyway, what you would have here is basically a fusion generator would be necessary. Fission would probably fry the pilot. Puppy would probably eat the pilot. But if you can get a powerful enough current going from here around the gyroscopic cabin, and you get enough current going to here, you create a very powerful magnetic field. Now this field is the result, this EMF is the result of, well, not result, but what it results in, I should say, is that air and particles from this area are rerouted to the next available lowest resistance point, which is going to be a vacuum of air here. You'll have this same effect at every wave interval going all the way around. So, what happens, let's back up a little bit. So, you have here the excess, a severe excess of electrons. Okay, they go through a conductive media to the shortage of electrons. Now, the field that results outside of it carries with it and charges along with it. It basically rarefies, stratifies, filters the air, whatnot, and you create a little vacuum in this area that sucks the craft forward, and then that pushes the air even more so out of the way, which brushes along until it reaches the next point of least resistance, which is going to be the vacuum in back of the craft. So as this vacuum fills up with air, it's going to push it forward a little bit. And what you have is a vehicle that effectively creates its own little air tunnel right in front of it through the layers of the air. Now you don't have, just kind of, so when you, what you have is once you manage to attain once you manage to attain the correct state, you can create this tunnel in front of your craft, a little wind tunnel, basically, kind of like the tunnels at the bank where you put the little canister in with your ID and your check, for those of you who ever had to use a drive-up bank account, and the tube goes through it, or the really old administrative offices where they sent messages through the vacuum tubes. Well, that's basically what this does. And there's a lot of benefits to it, because ordinarily, if you have an aircraft, right? That's my artistic rendering of an aircraft. It's hitting these pockets of air all the time. So it's having to break the air in front of it. Now, of course, the better and better you get at aerospace design, the more you can narrow this envelope. And you can probably, I know you can even get specific materials that will help to guide the airflow to the shape of the craft. But you still have to break the initial air. And you're breaking through these, and it's not like the air is just a nice little uniform cloud all throughout. You've got disruptive pockets and bubbles, basically. You could think of them as really big bubbles all in the air. It's like trying to drive through a carbonated soda, really. Okay? But if your craft is instead peeling the layers between the air around you, you're not popping these bubbles. You're not breaking the air. You're just gently pushing them out of the way for a moment. So you will create some turbulence. And you would be physically, present and stuff. But being able to slide between layers of air allows you to achieve vectors much, much faster than conventional aircraft, because you remove one of the largest limiting factors of the coefficient of friction, the air resistance. Now, an added benefit of this is that the scale of power we're talking about here is not like your school magnet where you dump some iron filings in order to see this magnetic field. This magnetic field would be so powerful, you basically wouldn't be able to see through it very easily, if at all, because it would distort all the light around it. You have to remember that visible light is a part of the EMF spectrum. So these electromagnetic fields going around it are going to distort it a whole lot. So the craft would probably look like it was colorless, or it would look like whatever's on the other side of it, or it would look white, or it would look silvery. It would probably be lit regardless, because it's a lot of light, to be messing with the electromagnetic field. And I personally haven't gotten to see a magnetic field that powerful with my naked eye, so I can only guess as far as what it would look like, but it would effectively render the craft either obscured or invisible, if it was that powerful of a magnetic field. It would also, it would allow the craft to travel in one direction, but, when you need to change directions, that's where it's a bit trickier. But that's also why you need to have a gyroscopic cockpit, so that the pilot always has a nice steady frame of reference. This conductive media between the cathode and the anode needs to be piezostatic in nature, so that the pilot can activate whatever controls are necessary to send an electric charge through the conductive media to alter its state, alter its conductiveness, its its composition, its fields. That will allow you to compress and stretch and alter the fields as you need to, so you could actually steer the thing instead of just flying one direction indefinitely, which wouldn't be nearly as useful. So ultimately what would allow you to happen is your craft could just easily hover in place. Sorry, that's a pretty poor looking craft. But since you have a gyroscopic cockpit, your pilot still is able to remain facing upright. Meanwhile, you have your vacuum exerting enough of a vacuum at the top of the craft and enough of a bubble of air, an influx of air at the bottom of the craft, that it's pushing up and pulling up with just enough force to maintain the craft. And so you can just hover in place indefinitely without any apparent means of propulsion, and still enjoy the added benefit of a relatively obscured or invisible craft. Now, this piezostatic fluid in here, and I do say fluid, it could be a gas, I suppose. You probably would not want to use a solid, because since you can now ignore the coefficient of friction, well, not ignore, but it lowers the limits considerably, we'll put it that way. Since you can lower the limits involving stopping your craft of the coefficient of friction, you can now go much, much faster than conventional aircraft. You could also turn at basically the same speed that you could control the piezostatic media to change the field state. So as soon as you could send the control information to change the piezostatic media, the faster you can change the orientation of the rod and have it fly off in a different direction. Again, though, you don't want to turn the pilot into soup. And one of the ways you can do that is by making sure this piezostatic fluid can slowly, what's the word I'm looking for? Absorb and distribute. Distribute, that's the word I'm looking for. So that that piezostatic media is both conductive and able to be shaped by command, but also needs to be capable of absorbing and distributing the impact of G-forces. So if you have a spherical gyroscopic cockpit that's capable of sliding back and forth with the fluid, it should be able to take those G-forces and spread them out instead of, just the pilot and their seat and, one primary vector of force. Instead, you split all those force vectors along each of the molecules of this piezostatic media. And since it's piezostatic and you can change the state of it, you can set the ideal rate of solidification, liquefaction, gasification, and wear to stop the bubble before it crashes into the engine or liquefies the pilot, or causes them some sort of serious harm. Now, the reason you would need a meat pilot in the first place is because trying to send a signal to this thing would be extremely difficult. You would basically have to render the craft visible again, losing whatever obscurement or invisibility that it would have in order to send it or receive a new set of instructions via remote control. So hypothetically, you could do that. You could just have a drone that executed a certain amount of autonomous instructions at a time, but you would not be able to change its instructions mid-flight unless you had something that could penetrate through electromagnetic fields, such as holographic thought and manipulation, or you know, telepathy, remote viewing sort of thing. I'm not saying that those, I'm not saying anything about those right now. I just don't have I don't have enough computation on that yet to know what I want to say. But as far as this goes, yeah, the theory is there, and it's been there since, I don't know, 30s, 40s, somewhere around there. If you look at Nick Cook's book, The Hunt for Zero Point, he's done a very, very, very good job of documenting this. And the documentation has only been added to over the years. But as far as a basic book on how this works, that's probably the best place to start your journey. And the rest of this is kind of derived from the science that we've learned since then, in the course of 20 years or so. But yeah, the problem has never really been the understanding of it. There's been small scale models of this, of craft that when tethered can do great things. The problem is, untethered, you're limited by the amount of power that you can generate. So, you know, you couldn't take, say, a Tesla car battery and be able to run a craft like this in the air for any appreciable length of time or mass. In all likelihood, a chemical battery, your typical chemical battery, is never going to have the kind of output necessary to lift its own mass in this fashion. You end up having to connect to a larger source or a power plant or something of the sort, which is why you can tether these and make them work. And by tether, I mean have an electric cord going to them, and they'll work out okay, especially in the smaller, 5 kilograms or less, somewhere around there. But when you start getting to scale upwards and you're still having to fight gravity, because here's the thing, this is not an anti-gravity tech. That's kind of what I was touching on earlier, is this isn't anti-gravity, this is more like fluid dynamics and being able to manipulate them. And the thrust that's generated by this right now at what's the word, useful scales for us, just isn't efficient enough. It's nowhere near the efficiency that we get with chemical thrust for conventional jets and things. That's why we don't have, hypothetically, armies of these things. Armies. That's why we don't. That's why our Air Force hasn't been replaced by these yet, because you would need something with the equivalent of a fusion engine in order to lift its own mass, and the pilot or its CPU and whatnot, and a computing system, and its piezostatic and everything else. So anyway, now it doesn't have to be in that shape either. I mean, really, just that one rod would give you a single person craft, but you could make a larger craft as long as it was balanced out. So, you could have, say, 3 separate, let's do a side view. Alright, so now imagine 3 of those rods in a craft stacked that way from a front view, but then from a top view or a side view, you lift it this way. Well, now you have much more thrust that you can exhibit. You have a much larger experimental or whatever cabin space, operation space that you can do things with, and you would gain, I'm not entirely sure what the effect would be of having these 3 separate fields, but I'm sure with enough tweaking and piezostatic input, it would be easily enough added. So yeah, I mean, that's another design you could do. I'm sure that you could compress the design and just have, you know, one single drone. If you eliminate the need for cabin space, then you don't even need this rod anymore, because you no longer have the need to protect a human. All you need to have is your engine, your cathode, your anode, and then whatever the computing space is inside of it. Now, another problem with this is it would probably be very radioactive in some way or another. Microwave radiation would probably be my first guess as a result of this. And I mean, if you got the piezostatic media in there, like mercury or something like that, aligned just right, you know, you could have a maintaining field, but at the same time have a directed field that you could aim at things and basically hit them with the speed of whatever radiation you were using, presumably microwave, I suppose. And then as far as the media itself goes, of course, there's going to be times when, because it's going to heat up, so the type of media that you use is gonna, you're gonna have to have some kind of a heat sink, presumably in there. But this, if not, then you'd have to dump the media every so often because it'd be white hot. So just another thing to think about. Anyway, this has been NOD3. And this has been a primer on electrogravitics, or, you know, a little less accurately anti-gravity, perhaps more accurately electrostatic effects on fluid dynamics. Goodbye from the Night Watch Institute.